let us now go on to the talk session. We now invite Mr. Osamu Nagase, Senior Researcher at Ritsumeikan Arts Vivendi Research Institute and Secretary General at Inclusion International, to give us his lecture. The theme of the presentation is "What is a reasonable accommodation? A bridge to a society in which diversity counts." The floor is yours, Mr. Nagase. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Nagase. So, you just watched a footage of Dr. Mark Bookman, and this is a PR of the documentary. And Ron Small, who is the producer and the manager, and who is doing the final compilation. And so he wants to do the premiere, global premiere in Japan, and this he will be coming. The producer will coming to Japan with Mark's father, who was in the footage. Mark had his longing for Japan, and he really loved Japan. So we want to follow his steps with this documentary, and he wanted to open the premiere, the first thing in Japan. And that was the wish of the father and also the wish of the producer. And I met Mr. Bookman 10 years ago for the first time. And Mark came to Japan on as a Fulbright scholar. And there are many people on the wheelchair must be experiencing this. So is there a barrier-free accessible apartment in Japan for a wheelchaired person? And he didn't have much luck. And so I became acquainted with him, and I helped him look for a barrier-free apartment in Tokyo. And in those days, Dr. Bookman was trying to do the research for the ancient Japanese Buddhism, and his dream was to go to visit the Mount Koya. And when he was young, he read The Silence authored by Shuichi Endo, and he was heavily influenced by the novel Silence by Endo. And Joshua was in the movie, and he mentioned that Dr. Bookman was a very kind person, and if you ask him something, he was always there to respond to you immediately. And I serve as the chairperson of the Disability Association, and I started this 2 years ago, and he promptly joined the association after my request. And he was supposed to be very active in the discipline of the studies for the disability, and he was serving as the chairman of the international committee in this association of the disability, and I had thought that he would be able to serve as the chairman of the Japan Association for the people with disabilities. And beyond the disability, he would become somebody really awesome like Donald Keene in terms of Japan studies. And I feel very grateful that I was able to learn so much from Mark-san. And I'm sure he is watching me from somewhere, and he is giving me his hearty support from his realm. Now let's go into my discussion. So Mark-san and all these people with disabilities, they experience all kinds of difficulties. And in order to solve that, there's one solution, reasonable accommodation. And this is the endeavor. We call it reasonable accommodation in English. And let me walk you through quickly on this. And let's think about this topic. So we call it CRPD, and during the keynote opening speech, there is a Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and including neurodiversity, not just persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory dysfunctions, and CRPD looks at the environment of the people with disabilities. So when you think of when you imagine the people with disabilities, there's social barriers, and various barriers hinder the social participation of the PODs. And so the PODs are the CRPD tried to address the people who are hindered for social participation because of some reason. And we call it the social model of the disability. And this social model, based on the social model, which is based on the CRPD, they try to renew the understanding for a disability. Just because this person is disabled, they are removed or they are repelled. So this was a direct discrimination. And CRPD went even further by saving a reasonable accommodation. This is conducive to the discrimination against the people with disabilities. How do you define the reasonable accommodation in the CRPD? The person who are CRPD, the changes and accommodation for each and every persons with disabilities, or treat them in an exceptional manner. For example, somebody who has ASD, there should be a response. They should be treated in the manner that is aligned to their disability. And this is kind of endeavor is called the reasonable accommodation. And the absence of reasonable accommodation is discrimination. And CRPD in Japan in 2014 has ratified it in 2014 in Japan. And because of that, they had to change various laws, and some new laws were established. One of them is, for the first time in law, they use the term discrimination. This is the Disability Discrimination Elimination Act. And again, similarly to CRPD, if the social barrier, people who are restricted by social barrier are considered as people with disabilities, and that's a new definition added. And based on those people who people with disabilities require reasonable accommodation. So the Japanese rule has transformed immensely thanks to this act, and we also have Disabled Persons Employment Promotion Act, and within this act, the people who already have the workers who have disabilities, and to provide them with a reasonable accommodation is mandated. And maybe for the first time you may have heard the term reasonable disability. So let us look into some concrete examples.
So at supermarkets, there are products all the way up on the shelf. Then if a person is on wheelchair, then the supermarket worker will give the product to the person on wheelchair. So that's the reasonable accommodation. And also you see this pad that people who cannot hear, they write to communicate. And also the Braille language that was explained to us. So large letters or writing in a pen or reading out, those are all reasonable accommodations. And for people with intellectual disability, if they cannot understand, then they write a memo for understanding. And also, this is the last category, a person who cannot queue up. Maybe they include neurodiverse people. So you have to ask people around and then let him go ahead. This is done at Disneyland. And also, or if you can have a seating closer to the screen so he will see. So there are rules or there are things that you used to do, but you have to be flexible to change that so that each individual will not be disadvantaged. So that is the third category. From April next year, I think those of you who work in companies, a law to eliminate disability discrimination, this will be changed because reasonable accommodation was not mandatory. But from April 1st next year, even customers who come to shops, you need to have reasonable accommodation to them. Right now, I work at Ritsumeikan University. So professors, there's a mandate to give reasonable accommodation to professors, but for students with disabilities, Ritsumeikan University does not need to provide reasonable accommodation. So that's the current situation in Japan. But this will change from April 1st next year. Students with disabilities, consumers with disability, they will be given reasonable accommodation, and this will become a mandate to the business owners. Now, let's talk about how this was born and how it's developed. In 1964, in the U.S., there was a civil um, and so in the U.S., the people, the discrimination against religion was prohibited. This was civil rights. For U.S., Friday afternoon, Jewish people cannot engage in a lot of activities. So for Jewish people, they don't have to do any overtime on Friday evening. And if Muslims, if they had to pray, so they provided a special break for the Muslims, and this was called reasonable accommodation, and this would eliminate discrimination against Muslims or Jewish. And in 1973, there was a rehabilitation law, and this became a mandate. Reasonable accommodation became a mandate. So for people with disability. And in 1990, the Papa Bush, during his administration, there was a ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, was made, and in 2006, when the CRPD was adopted, discrimination included lack of reasonable accommodation. So that's the history in short. So I think all of you have interest in this issue. So let's talk about accessibility and the relation between accessibility and reasonable accommodation. Accessibility is in Japan called, it is providing barrier-free beforehand to the unspecific people. But reasonable accommodation means that we have to provide barrier-free to each one of the disability. Let's give an example. Let's hold a lecture session. So, okay, the event will provide a sign language before, even though they don't know whether there will be people, deaf people, or and then if the deaf people asked for a sign language beforehand, then they provide the sign language. So we need both accessibility and reasonable accommodation. Last year, there was a CRPD assessment by the UN, and that was important item included. We must include the people with disability, and this relates to diversity. When you look at the relation between the two, each individual, there must be a system to change something or adjust something for each individual people with disability. This is necessary. This started in religion, and now in disability area, this is now flourishing. So difference in culture, language, gender. In Canada, gender difference or sex difference, or if the people must give care to families, the company's rules could be changed to accommodate these, and it's called reasonable accommodation. That's in Canada. So, to conclude, I want to talk about drama. This was 1979. I was a student, and I was in a volunteer circle for children with disability. This was NHK drama, and it was talking about a wheel on the wheelchair. And this was written by Yamada Taichi and Tsuruta Koji. He was a war veteran. He's a godman. And he says to the people with disabilities, right now in this society, you should not be a nuisance to other people, but that is a shackle for you. So you can be a burden to others. Of course, you shouldn't be a nuisance, but I think you can still be a burden. You should be a burden. You should proudly be a burden. You might say you want to abide by normal rules, but I don't agree. You should be able to go out, and you should be able to ride on a train. You should go up the stairs, and the society that does not enable you to do this is not right. So you should be proud, he said. So in 1979, Yamada Taichi already talked about this reasonable accommodation. Thank you.